Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every person's life when they stand at a crossroads. A decision must be made. Which path should I take? Which door should I walk through? The world will tell you to follow your heart, to do what feels right. But I am here to tell you, let God choose for you. We serve a God who knows the end from the beginning. He sees what we cannot see. When we make choices in our own strength, we rely on limited understanding. But when we surrender to His will, we step into a life of divine purpose, a life where His hand guides our every step. How many times have we made a decision that we thought was right, only to find ourselves trapped in disappointment? We chase after dreams, relationships, and opportunities, believing they will bring happiness, only to discover that without God, they leave us empty. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. Your understanding is limited, but God's wisdom is infinite. The job you think is best, the relationship you desperately want, the plans you've made, what if God has something greater? What if His choice leads to blessings beyond what you could imagine? Some of you here today are wrestling with God. You want control. You want to decide. But the moment you surrender to Him, you step into peace that surpasses all understanding. Look at the life of Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, He prayed, not my will, but yours be done. If the Son of God chose to surrender to the Father, how much more should we? You may not understand what God is doing. You may not see the full picture, but I promise you this. His choice is always best. Some of you are waiting on God. You've prayed and the answer hasn't come. But let me remind you, God's delays are not His denials. Just because you haven't seen the answer yet doesn't mean He isn't working behind the scenes. When Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers, it seemed like his dreams were over. But what man meant for evil, God used for good. Had Joseph chosen his own path, he would have never risen to second in command over Egypt. God is not just concerned about where you're going, He's shaping you for the journey. The greatest choice you will ever make is whether you will let God lead your life. Many people chase after wealth, fame, and success, only to find themselves lost. But when you let God choose, you walk in His favor, His blessing, and His eternal purpose. Today, I challenge you, surrender your plans to the Lord. Let Him choose for you. Trust that His way is higher, His thoughts are greater, and His love for you is beyond measure. Will you let God choose for you today? If you will, you will never regret it. For His choice is always the best. God bless you. We live in a world that glorifies self-sufficiency. From a young age, we are taught to plan, to strategize, to make decisions based on what we see and what we know. Society tells us to trust our instincts, follow our hearts, and lean on our own understanding. But the reality is, our understanding is limited. We only see a small fragment of the picture, while God sees the entire masterpiece. When we rely on our own wisdom, we often walk into confusion, disappointment, and regret. But when we trust in God's wisdom, we step into a life where every choice is guided by divine knowledge, where every step is ordered by the one who holds all things in His hands. But think for a moment about the limitations of human understanding. We make choices based on what appears right in the moment, without truly knowing where they will lead. We accept jobs thinking they will bring security, into relationships believing they will bring happiness, and chase after goals that we assume will fulfill us. But how many times have we made a decision only to look back and realize that we were wrong? We thought that opportunity was the right one, but it led to stress and anxiety. We thought that person was the right one, but they left us broken. We thought that plan was foolproof, but it collapsed before our eyes. Now contrast this with God's wisdom. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This means that what may seem good to us in the moment may not be God's best. It also means that what may seem like a setback to us may actually be a setup for something greater. God is not limited by time, space, or human logic. He sees the future as clearly as we see the present. He knows the things we do not know. He understands the paths that lead to destruction and the ones that lead to life. Look at the life of Abraham. When God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place that he would show him, Abraham had no map, no certainty, no plan. All he had was a word from God. If he had leaned on his own understanding, he would have stayed where he was, comfortable and secure. But because he trusted in God's wisdom, he became the father of many nations. God's plan was far greater than Abraham could have ever imagined. Consider Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, but his journey to that destiny did not follow human logic. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If Joseph had relied on his own wisdom, he might have believed that God had abandoned him. But God was orchestrating something far greater. In the end, Joseph rose to power, and what was meant for evil, God turned for good. Think about how many times in Scripture people tried to lean on their own understanding, only to face failure. King Saul took matters into his own hands when he offered a sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel, and it cost him his kingdom. The Israelites, afraid of the giants in the promised land, doubted God's wisdom and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. When we rely on our limited perspective, we make decisions that lead to unnecessary pain. But when we trust in God, we walk in the fullness of His plan. Perhaps you are standing at a crossroads today, trying to decide which direction to take. You have analyzed the pros and cons, weighed the risks, and thought through every possible outcome. But have you stopped to ask God what He wants? Have you surrendered your plans and said, "Oh Lord, not my will, but yours be done"? The truth is, trusting in God's wisdom does not mean we will always understand His ways. It does not mean that everything will make sense in the moment. There will be times when He asks us to wait when we want to move. There will be times when He closes a door we desperately wanted open. There will be times when He leads us in a direction that seems completely opposite of what we expected. But every single time, His plan will prove to be perfect. Every single time, we will look back and realize that His way was better than ours. Some of you may be struggling with a decision right now. You're afraid of making the wrong choice. But let me tell you something. When you surrender your choices to God, you cannot go wrong. When you place your trust in His wisdom, you will never regret it. Even if the path looks uncertain, even if it requires faith, even if it goes against your natural instincts, trust Him, for He knows what is best. We must come to a place where we are willing to say, "Lord, I do not have to understand. I do not have to see the full picture." Or you then could see the full picture. I do not have to know every detail. I simply trust that You are good, that You are faithful, and that Your wisdom is far greater than mine. God's wisdom surpasses human understanding. It always has, and it always will. So today I urge you, let go of control. Lay down your own reasoning. Stop trying to figure it all out on your own. Place your life in the hands of the One who knows all things, and trust that His wisdom will lead you exactly where you need to be. And when you do, you will walk in peace, knowing that the God who created the universe is guiding your every step. We live in a world that tells us freedom is found in control. The more control we have over our lives, our choices, our future, the freer we think we will be. Society tells us to take charge, to create our own destiny, to hold the reins of our lives with a firm grip. But time and time again, we see that this pursuit of control leads not to freedom, but to anxiety, stress, and frustration. We fight for control, and yet we find ourselves exhausted, burdened, and uncertain. True freedom is not found in controlling our own destiny. It is found in surrendering our lives into the hands of the one who already knows the end from the beginning. Surrender is not weakness. It is the greatest act of trust. When we surrender to God, we are not losing control. We are giving control to the one who has always been in control. We are choosing to trust that his plan is greater, his wisdom is higher, and his love is deeper than anything we could ever comprehend. Think about the burden that comes with trying to control everything. When we rely on our own strength, we bear the weight of every decision, every problem, and every unknown. We lie awake at night, wondering if we are making the right choices. We stress over outcomes that are beyond our control. We hold on so tightly to our plans that we fear what will happen if things don't go the way we expect. But when we surrender to God, that weight is lifted. The moment we say, "Lord, I trust you. I place my life in your hands," we experience a peace that surpasses all understanding. Look at the life of Jesus. He walked in complete surrender to the Father. In the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the agony of the cross, he prayed, "And not my will, but yours be done." If anyone had the right to take control, it was Jesus. Yet, he chose surrender. And through that surrender, salvation was made available to the entire world. If Jesus, the Son of God, trusted the Father's plan, how much more should we? So many people resist surrender because they believe it means losing something. They fear that if they let go, they will miss out. They fear that if they give their lives to God, they will lose their dreams, their desires, their identity. But the truth is, surrender does not take away who you are. It reveals who you were always meant to be. When you surrender, you step into the fullness of God's purpose for your life. You exchange your limited plans for his greater vision. You exchange temporary happiness for eternal joy. Look at Abraham. God asked him to leave his home, his security, and everything familiar to go to a land that he would show him. Abraham had no details, no guarantees, only a promise from God. If he had held on to control, he would have never stepped into the destiny that God had prepared for him. But because he surrendered, he became the father of many nations. Think about Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses was filled with doubts and excuses. He didn't feel qualified. He didn't feel capable. But when he surrendered to God's calling, he witnessed miracles beyond imagination. He saw the Red Sea part, manna fall from heaven, and water flow from a rock. His surrender led to the deliverance of an entire nation. What about you? What are you holding on to so tightly that it is keeping you from experiencing the freedom God has for you? Is it fear? Is it pride? Is it the belief that your way is better than God's way? The longer you hold on to control, the more you will struggle. But the moment you surrender, you will feel the weight lift. You will experience the freedom of knowing that your life is in the hands of a loving, sovereign God who will never fail you. God does not ask us to surrender so that he can take something from us. He asks us to surrender so that he can give us something greater. When we release our plans, he gives us his purpose. When we let go of our worries, he gives us his peace. When we surrender our lives, he fills us with his presence. There is no greater freedom than living in the will of God. No greater peace than knowing he is in control. No greater joy than trusting in his plan. So today I ask you, are you ready to surrender? Are you ready to let go of control and place your life in the hands of the one who loves you more than you can ever imagine? If you are, then you will find the freedom your soul has been longing for. You will walk in the peace and purpose that only comes from trusting in the one who holds all things together. Let go, trust him, surrender, and step into true freedom. We live in a fast-paced world where waiting feels like a burden. We expect instant results, immediate answers, and quick solutions. When things don't happen according to our timeline, we grow anxious, frustrated, and sometimes even doubtful. We pray, but the answer doesn't come. We hope, but the breakthrough seems distant. We knock, but the door remains closed. And in those moments of waiting, it is easy to believe that God has forgotten us. But hear this truth today. A delay from God is not a denial. It is often his way of preparing something greater than we could ever imagine. Throughout the Bible, we see that God's timing is different from ours. He is never in a hurry, yet he is never late. He works according to his divine plan, orchestrating every detail with precision and purpose. What may seem like a delay to us is actually God positioning things perfectly in his will. When he holds back an answer, it is not because he is ignoring us. It is because he is working behind the scenes, preparing us, shaping us, and making a way that is far better than we could ever create on our own. Think about Joseph. As a young man, he had dreams of greatness. God revealed to him that he would one day be in a position of authority. But instead of stepping into that destiny immediately, he was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Years passed, and it must have seemed as if the promise was forgotten. But God had not abandoned Joseph. Every trial he faced was preparing him for the position God had ordained for him. When the right time came, Joseph was not only released from prison, but was elevated to the second highest position in Egypt. The delay was not a denial, it was preparation. Had Joseph risen to power too soon, he would not have been ready to handle it. Look at Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a son, but years went by and nothing happened. They waited, and still no child came. In their impatience, they tried to take matters into their own hands, leading to unnecessary pain and complications. But God had not forgotten his promise. At the appointed time, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. The delay was not a denial. It was a test of faith, a journey of trust, and ultimately the fulfillment of a divine plan that would bless generations. Consider the Israelites. God promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, yet they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Was it because God had abandoned them? No. It was because he was preparing them, teaching them dependence on him, refining their hearts, and equipping them to step into their inheritance. The delay was not a denial. It was a process of transformation. Even in the life of Jesus, we see the power of divine timing. When his friend Lazarus was sick, Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, expecting him to come immediately. But Jesus delayed. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. To those watching, it must have seemed like Jesus was too late. But he was not late. He was perfectly on time. If he had come earlier, he would have healed Lazarus. But by waiting, he did something even greater. He raised Lazarus from the dead. The delay was not a denial. It was an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed in a greater way. How often do we get discouraged when we don't see immediate results? How many times do we pray, and when the answer doesn't come right away, we assume that God has said no? But what if his delay is actually his mercy? What if he is protecting us from something we cannot see? What if he is refining our character, strengthening our faith, and positioning us for something greater than we could ever imagine? Sometimes the delay is there to teach us trust. It is in the waiting that we learn to rely on God, to seek him, and to draw closer to him. If everything happened immediately, we would never develop endurance, patience, or a deep faith. God's delays are not meant to frustrate us. They are meant to prepare us. Maybe you are in a season of waiting right now. And you have been praying for something, a breakthrough, a healing, a restored relationship, an open door. And it feels like nothing is happening. But let me remind you today, God has not forgotten you. His timing is perfect. His plans for you are still in motion. What you see as a delay is actually divine positioning. Do not lose heart. Do not give up. Keep trusting, keep believing, and keep waiting on the Lord. Because when the time is right, the answer will come. And when it does, you will see that every moment of waiting was worth it. For his ways are higher, his thoughts are greater, and his plans are always best. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to chase after temporary success, wealth, and recognition. Society tells us to pursue what feels good, what looks appealing, and what brings immediate satisfaction. But the choices we make in this life are not just about the here and now. They have eternal significance. Every decision we make is either leading us closer to God's purpose or pulling us away from it. And while the world offers temporary rewards, God's choices always lead to eternal reward. Throughout Scripture, we see that when people follow God's direction, even when it didn't make sense at the time, they were blessed beyond what they could have imagined. God's way is not always the easiest or the most comfortable, but it is always the best. The rewards of following him may not always be immediate, but they are always lasting. Look at Moses. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by wealth, luxury, and power. By human standards, he had everything he could ever want. Yet when God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he had to make a choice. Stay in the palace and enjoy a temporary kingdom, or follow God and step into an eternal purpose. Moses chose to surrender his earthly status in exchange for a divine calling. And today, his name is remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history. The world's rewards would have faded, but God's choice led him to something far greater. Think about Esther. Wow, Esther. She was an orphan girl who became queen, but her position was not just for her comfort. When the Jewish people were in danger, she had to decide whether to risk her life by speaking up or to remain silent and protect herself. The easy choice would have been to stay quiet, to preserve her own safety. But God's choice led her to courage, and because she obeyed, an entire nation was saved. Consider the disciples. Jesus called them to leave everything behind, their jobs, their families, their comforts, to follow him. By the world's standards, they gave up everything. They faced persecution, suffering, and hardship. But in the end, they gained something far greater. They witnessed the power of God. They walked with Jesus himself, and they secured a place in his eternal kingdom. One of the greatest examples of choosing God's way is seen in the life of Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he faced the suffering of the cross. He prayed, "And not my will, but yours be done." In that moment, he had a choice. He could have avoided the pain, the humiliation, the suffering, but he chose obedience. And because of that choice, salvation was made available to all of humanity. How often do we struggle with choices in our own lives? The world offers us shortcuts, ways to gain success quickly, ways to achieve comfort without sacrifice, ways to obtain power without integrity. But those rewards never last. They may satisfy for a moment, but they leave us empty in the end. When we follow God's choice, we may not always see the reward immediately, but we can be sure that it is coming. God promises that those who remain faithful will reap a harvest if they do not give up. His rewards are not just for this life, but for eternity. Maybe today you are facing a difficult decision. Maybe God is calling you to step out in faith, to let go of something, to trust him even when it doesn't make sense. The choice may be hard, but know this: when you choose God's way, you will never regret it. His path leads to life, peace, and eternal joy. The world's rewards will fade. Money, will lose its value. Titles will be forgotten. Pleasures will pass away. But the rewards of following God will last forever. So choose wisely. Choose faith over fear. Choose obedience over convenience. Choose God's way over the world's way. Because His choice always leads to eternal reward. Life is full of choices, and each decision we make carries weight, not just for today, but for eternity. And the world tells us to chase after control, to seek immediate gratification, and to measure success by temporary standards. But God calls us to something greater. He asks us to trust Him, to surrender our plans, to wait on His perfect timing, and to choose His path over our own. And while His way is not always the easiest, it is always the best. Surrender is not losing, it is gaining true freedom. Waiting on God is not a waste, it is preparation for something greater. A delay is never a denial, it is an act of divine positioning. And when we choose God's way over our own, we do not just gain rewards for this life, we secure an eternal inheritance that will never fade. So today, I ask you, will you let go of control and trust in the one who holds the universe? Will you surrender your plans and embrace His purpose? Will you wait on His perfect timing, knowing that He is always faithful? And will you choose His way, knowing that His reward is eternal? God's plan for your life is greater than anything you could ever imagine. His wisdom surpasses human understanding. His ways are higher than our ways. And His love for you is unshakable. When you put your trust in Him, when you surrender, when you choose to follow His leading, you will never be disappointed. You will walk in His peace, His purpose, and His presence, not just for today, but for eternity.